Hi. The hard part in doing a video like this is just kind of introducing the subject and delimiting what I'm going to talk about, because I do not want this to be a 1 hour lecture um, reflecting on my extensive experience with not getting a PhD. So we're going to do this Francis Bacon thing and start with one example. I'm going to put up on screen here the text. This is a very polite reply I got from a PhD program within the last few months. And so it opens by saying, looking at your impressive CV, I'm not sure what program we have here would be good for you, i.e. what MA program, PhD program at that university. This is about getting an MA that would lead to a PhD. It says, well, on the one hand, we have studies in Indology and Tibetology, and for that you need to learn Sanskrit. On the other hand, we have a modern Asian studies program, but for this you have to learn Hindi. So this is a totally polite, totally constructive reply, totally useful information, but it explains why this particular graduate program excludes me, and why I would not opt for it. If you've seen the list of languages I've studied, it is already painfully long. I've studied too many languages for too many years, and I've grown old without becoming an expert in any one of them. I worked on a language called Pali for more than 10 years, I'd say, and then I worked on all these Southeast Asian languages that are connected to Pali, Laotian, Thai, Cambodian, minority languages from that area, but then also, to some extent, working on Burmese, Sinhalese. A lot goes into that. And then I had to throw all that aside and study Chinese after a certain point in my life. Then I had to stop studying Chinese and start learning Japanese. I'm learning Japanese now. I'm currently enrolled in a Japanese program, University of Victoria, Canada. So if you tell me that I'm welcome to come and get an MA and a PhD at university, but I would have to additionally learn Sanskrit and Tibetan, I'm not interested. If you say, well, you're welcome to come and work on political science of Asia, but you would have to learn Hindi, I'm not interested. And this is a nice letter because it doesn't say vice versa. It doesn't say they're not interested in me. It admits that I have an impressive CV, that I'd be a good student for them, but those are the program requirements. That's what the program can offer, and that's it. So for more than 10 years, I mean, probably like 15 years by now, I have been talking to different professors in different disciplines. By now, it is a long time ago, it exceeded 100 professors. Now it might be over 200 professors. And if you wonder how that's possible, well, I didn't just talk to professors in Canada. I'm talking to professors in Europe. You can even tell from that example I just looked at. This guy, English isn't his first language. I talked to professors in Asia over years and years, going to universities in person, talking to people face to face, and communicating by email and what have you. And my experience doing that, my experience being surrounded by having friends, girlfriends, wives, and so on, most of the people close to me in my life were themselves PhD students or professors or had PhDs or what have you. I've known a lot of people in the game, different stages and different ages. Last year, I talked to a guy. He was kind of working as an instructor, not a professor at University of Victoria. And he gave a lecture on how he selected his PhD program. And his whole process took place in about 1 month, during which he didn't do much thinking or research. He didn't talk to any professors. He was very busy with his own studies at the end of his BA. And he looked around at different MA programs. And he sent out a couple of applications without a lot of thought. He got answers back. I think only 2 of the institutions offered him a scholarship. He looked at the dollars and cents involved, which one would cost more money and which one would pay him more money and so on, and he made his choice. I appreciated his honesty in talking about that process. Now he relates to it. But he did not do anything like the process. He didn't visit even one university. He didn't interview or speak to even one professor. And in my case, I spoke to dozens and dozens of professors over, again, more than 10 years, and I actually traveled in person to universities and so on. So my perspective is very different. And the other thing is, because I was in a position to say no, very often these professors are only talking to students who've already invested tens of thousands of dollars. They've already invested a ton of money in getting a diploma. So the professor is limited in what advice they can give. If you've already spent $40,000 embarking on a certain career path, the professor is not as likely to tell you, look, this is a bad option, this is a bad institution, and this degree can't lead to any employment for you. In my position, they were free to tell that to me, and many of them did. I can remember, especially with SOAS in London, the School of Oriental and African Studies, a famous university within the University of London, a remarkable number of people, professors, former graduate students from there and so on, took me aside and said, look, this is a bad university and this is a bad department and here are the problems. Don't do it. Don't come here. And I completely appreciate their honesty. I mean, and I take that advice seriously. One of the things that's really underrated in the 21st century is learning from your elders. That is definitely more of an 18th century value that's gone out of style. And how to learn from your elders, I mean, there's, obviously there are tensions involved. It's not as simple as just believing everything you hear. But there's a kind of expectation, I think mostly created by Hollywood movies, that the young apprentice or the young aspiring sports hero will be faced with many challenges, but will, boldly ignore all of the good advice to the contrary. It was, oh no, this is my dream, and I believe in my dream, and I'm willing to do it. No. The mature attitude to take, especially towards advice about institutions, from within institutions, if someone risks their own job, if someone risks their own professional reputation to tell you what's wrong with their employer, because that's basically what they're doing. They're basically ratting out their superiors. They're basically saying what's wrong with this institution that they rely on to pay their rent. You need to take that very seriously. You need to take that to heart. Even if that person maybe doesn't have your best interest at heart. They may be telling you that for all kinds of reasons. They may be very self-pitying. I can remember one professor from SOAS who was definitely telling me how terrible the university was because he was self-pitying. It may be for all kinds of reasons. But anyway, look, this is a roundabout intro to say I have looked at getting a PhD, of course, beginning with an MA, again and again over the years. One of the main reasons why it hasn't happened, which you see even in this first example, is the crucial importance of language, which is something I personally, subjectively, emotionally, and intellectually feel or believe in. The main value of any advanced diploma, in my opinion, is going to be language acquisition. Now, when I finished my BA 100 years ago, whenever that happened, there was absolutely zero language education available to me in any of the languages I wanted to study. So those languages included Burmese, Cambodian, Pali, Lao, Sinhalese, language of Sri Lanka. I was interested in a whole bunch of Southeast Asia. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying there were absolutely no universities anywhere in the world teaching or studying those languages. There were just a few. But none of them were options for me, and most of them were quite problematic. Like, again, so SOAS, I've mentioned, as a bad option, as something that people warn me about. Does SOAS really teach Burmese? Does SOAS really teach Cambodian as a language? The answer to that changes every couple of years. And I don't even mean every 5 or 10 years. It can change from one year to the next. It's not reliable or simple to answer. And I know one girl who went to SOAS to get her MA in Khmer, in Cambodian, Khmer, whatever you want to say, in the Cambodian language. And after she had spent all this money, because England is incredibly expensive if you're not a British citizen, if you're an international student, she spent all this money and went there. And they just told her, the Cambodian classes were not making enough money. So we canceled the Cambodian class, and now you're going to have to learn Vietnamese instead. Vietnamese is a completely different language from Cambodian. And politically, there's a huge wall between the two countries politically. There's also been a huge war between the two countries. Both are true. But in terms of the effect it would have on your own career aspirations, just your own life, to be suddenly forced into learning Vietnamese instead of Cambodian, like honestly, in the whole world, it's not like the difference between Spanish and Portuguese. They're both profoundly different languages linguistically in terms of the vocabulary you're going to memorize. But still today, the degree of hatred between those two countries, it's very volatile. So putting yourself in a really terrible situation. This is very far from the worst story I could tell you about bad things that happen to nice people in PhD programs. But in any case, the number one consideration for me has been language. And then also, the work I've done in languages has excluded me from many university programs. As you've just seen in one example, there are a million other examples, and that's cool. As long as everyone is honest and open about it, I have no problem with that. If you want to tell me, hey, our program requires you to learn Hindi, I say, okay, not for me. The disappointing thing is that when I sold out, when I said, okay, fine, I'll learn Chinese, the mainstream language, instead of working on a language like Lao or Pali, something more obscure, I still had no options. So that is sad for me. It's a real source of sorrow in my life. And then when I couldn't study Chinese anymore and I was forced to study Japanese by circumstances that have already been described on this YouTube channel, again, a great source of sorrow and a lot of things to reconsider. There's a really interesting historical background to each of these departments and disciplines. Southeast Asian studies, the part of Southeast Asia I'm interested in, because I worked on Buddhist Southeast Asia, right? I did not work on Indonesia or Malaysia. Those are Muslim countries. I worked on countries like Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, etc. And for a long time, I would have very much appreciated finding any academic program that allowed me to further develop expertise in that area. Generally speaking, there was kind of a very short blip of academic interest and research in that part of Asia during and after the Vietnam War. And then all those departments collapsed and crumbled and disappeared. And even their publications, even the journals, disappeared. But unlike Chinese studies that has grown and grown, mostly because people have the delusion that they can get rich by learning how to speak Chinese, studies in other parts of Southeast Asia have collapsed. Now, and the exceptions to that rule don't interest me. The Dutch, in general, still make a big deal out of studying Indonesia because they have a colonial history there. There's this link between the Netherlands and Indonesia. That has nothing to do with me. So it's still called Southeast Asia, but it's not my area of studies. So that type of historical background, there's a lot more to say about it. Again, fits into the puzzle. I'm not even mentioning here the terrible history of what's called Buddhist studies and Theravada Buddhism and Pali. Within Buddhist studies, I think there have been some reflections on that on this channel, some on my blog and writing and so on. But as I've said bluntly on this channel, the situation for that area of studies was just that there was absolutely nobody in the field I could respect or want to become the student of or work with. The whole field was just in a terrible state when it mattered for me, for someone in my generation, aspiring to be a scholar in that field. The other problem, the number two problem I'm encountering still today, is the definition of the discipline itself. What is Asian studies? I receive much less polite letters of rejection from universities that just write in to tell me, forget it, we just do poetry, so we don't want you. This example, this guy says my CV is impressive. Well, my CV leans more towards political reality, social sciences, etc. If you define Asian studies as the study of literature, and you only do, say, Japanese poetry and medieval Chinese novels, romances, books like The Dream of the Red Chamber, that sort of thing, then you don't want me as a PhD student. And I don't want you as my professor. I don't want to be your PhD student. I do not want to just write my opinions about literature. And that is the way many departments of Asian studies define what they do. So then you get into the problem of other disciplines. Well, if the discipline is not Asian studies, what is the discipline? Is it politics? Is it history? Where in the social sciences would someone like myself fit? And this is why I've spoken to so many professors, because I can go up to someone who's a professor of anthropology and say, well, this is the type of research I've done in the past, this is the type of research I aspire to in the future. Can I fit into your department of anthropology? There's one professor of sociology I've talked to at some length too, and he said, yeah, maybe. But each of those disciplines have different questions of how they define the discipline. In many cases, the definition of discipline excludes someone like me. And again, that's okay. I don't feel bad about that emotionally, as long as everyone is honest and open about what the requirements are. It's okay. But yeah, the result is we have a system, both nationally and globally, that leaves huge provinces of human knowledge untouched. If you think about the meaning of the word university, this is supposed to be universal. Now, to give you an example, within my own province in Canada, I believe the original plan for our province was that the university up the street in UBC in Vancouver, that university would specialize in Japan and China. And that my university in Victoria would instead specialize in Southeast Asia. And for that reason, we still have at least one professor who does Indonesia. Plan didn't work. And instead, both universities, two universities, were cannibalizing each other, competing to do exactly the same thing, to specialize in Japan and China. And just down the street, literally down the street, within the city of Victoria, there are two universities very close together. Camosun was competing with Victoria, Camosun College and Victoria University, at teaching Chinese. So, universities in Canada, and Canada is in some ways typical, they're tricky because they're not free market, but they're also not part of a planned economy or any kind of top-down systematic approach to anything. Different universities are trying to organize their budgets in different ways, and the results are nearly random, and the results are largely determined by the personalities of the professors, how good they are at fundraising, how good they are at convincing other professors to follow their lead. University of Toronto, university I formerly studied at when I was a kid, they had at one time the largest department of Sanskrit and Indian studies. So basically a department of Indian studies of India, but including Sanskrit. They had the largest department of that kind anywhere in the world outside of India. It's something like 30 professors. It was ridiculous. Headed by A.K. Warder. Now that word headed was part of the problem. What did it mean to be the head of the department? And it tore itself apart and collapsed. And when I was there, they had just two professors doing anything in that field. And Sanskrit was not taught at all at the University of Toronto when I was there. So there was this ghost of A.K. Warder's great accomplishment. Now, I actually wrote an article way back then dealing with the history of what happened to that academic department. But my point here is, nobody in the Canadian government, nobody in the Department of Education, and nobody even working as a bureaucrat for the university sat down and planned that out. Nobody said, oh, okay, so Canada, it's a medium-sized country. We're going to have one university that specializes in India and one that specializes in Southeast Asia. We're not all going to do the same thing with Chinese. No. Randomly, just through the conflict of personalities and struggles for fundraising and petty squabbles, one university in Canada built up enormous potential in the study of India, and then that collapsed, and it was never replaced by anything. It's not as if another university in Canada took up the slack. So if you wanted to be a serious Indologist, if you wanted to study India, Canada is not the place. It could have been. In a parallel universe, it could have been. There is now one professor at University of Toronto who is trying to build a basis for Burmese studies, study of Myanmar. I wish him luck. Maybe he'll be greatly successful. That's really just at its beginnings. And if it wasn't an option for me in the last 10 years, my whole life would be very different if that program had gotten rolling, say, 10 years earlier, or even just 5 years earlier, then it started rolling. But now this institution building process is happening. But again, nobody planned that. And on the other hand, you can have a situation such as I've described, where it seems like every university in Canada is competing to teach Chinese and to attract students from China and to be Canada's gateway to China. And they are getting mediocre at best results, in many cases really terrible results, offering exactly the same services, offering exactly the same courses on Chinese as a language, and the same incredibly limited opportunities to do MA work and PhD work on, say, Chinese literature. Maybe, if you're lucky, Chinese politics. And again, I can say in a value-neutral way, as that has worked out for me, for the time I was alive, there have been no opportunities for me to get an MA or a PhD. Many people, when they first meet me, don't believe that. But then as they get to know me, yesterday I was talking to a professor of Chinese studies from Heidelberg, professor of classical Chinese and Chinese language, stuff like that. And when he started the conversation, he just didn't quite believe that I really had no opportunities to get an MA and PhD. But after talking to me for about an hour, he got the point. He really appreciated that actually this was something I had researched very thoroughly, and researched thoroughly again and again over time, and again on different continents. So that professor, he could relate to a lot of things I was saying, because his own education experience, he had a lot of experience in Taiwan. So when I was talking about the difficulty, and I eventually gave up trying to get a PhD in Taiwan, he knew exactly what I was talking about. So when he could relate to that, and then we talked a little bit about Europe, he's a professor here in Europe, we talked about the situation in Canada, so right away he could see the parallelisms, and then he really realized, okay, that I was being genuine, and I wasn't wildly exaggerating. I was really speaking from experience and saying, I've done the research, and I've looked at all the options, and there were no options for me.